So I'm Jiri, hi, and I'm gonna talk about how does Ansible's agentless architecture work. So it's basically one of the selling points of Ansible, that Ansible doesn't need agent. So before we start, here's some short summary of what I've done for Ansible. So I contributed a little bit and publishing most of my Ansible stuff on my GitHub site, so you can get a lot of inspiration there. And first, let's talk about what are the benefits of agentless architecture. So first of all, you don't need any agent, that's obvious. But it's not absolutely true, because although you don't need to install anything Ansible labeled on any host, you still need SSH for that. And you also need Python, but Python you can actually install through Ansible once you have the SSH connection working through the raw module. Another benefit is that there is nothing constantly running apart of the SSH daemon on the host, so you don't waste resources of the host. And it's also secure, more secure, because basically all the code Ansible runs is delivered on the node while the Ansible runs. So it's like fresh code. It's not code lying on the host, which could be changed before you run it and stuff like that. So what's actually the process, how the agentless thing works? So you have two sides. You have the local side, this is where you run Ansible, that's the control host, and then the remote host where you want to run Ansible tasks on. So on the control host, it basically gets all the code of the modules. Module is basically the task in your playbook or your role. That's basically represented by a module. So it gets the code of the module, it checks the dependencies of the module, bundles the dependencies to the code, creates a zip package of it, and then it creates a script where the zipped data is inserted into, and that script is then copied on the remote side via SSH. So there is either SFTP or SCP used for that. By default, it kind of uses either of those, but you can specify which one should be used. And once the code is there, then it gets executed later on. But there's also one important thing, that if you use the pipelining, which is a feature of Ansible, that basically there are two modes. Either you use pipelining or you don't use pipelining. So if you don't use pipelining, then the code, which is packed together with the execution script, is copied on the disk on the remote host and then executed. Where if you use pipelining, then the code doesn't end on the disk, but it's actually copied straight into the standard input of Python process. So that's first faster, because you don't have to store it on the disk, you don't have to load it from the disk when you want to execute it. And it's also more secure, because you basically don't store the stuff on the disk, so nobody can fiddle with it there. But the pipelining has a problem if you use older version of SSH or sudo. So if you have modern system, then it should be okay. So always use pipelining. But if you deal with some like I don't know, Red Hat 5 or stuff like that, then you might not be able to use pipelining. And on the remote host, basically the script which was copied over is executed through SSH command remotely. That unzips the data in memory and execute and import the module from that unzipped data and execute the script. And then the script basically runs the module, and the module returns a JSON message back to the control host through stdout, which is the standard output of it. So that's the process how Ansible actually works. So the preparation of the module code to be transferable to the remote host goes like this. So first, each task is represented by a module, right? So for example, like template or copy or file, so that's a module. So for each task, we read the module code and we check the dependencies. That's happening through the AST, which is Abstract Syntax Tree Python module that allows you to basically read a code, it compiles, and you can still like amend the code online before it gets executed. So that's what AST module is allowing you to do. But Ansible is not actually modifying the code. It just uses the code to walk through the tree of the language, Python language, and find the imports and then resolve the dependencies of the module. So the dependency of the module which gets resolved is only in the namespace of the Ansible module utils, which is basically the Ansible code. So if the module depends on a third-party Python library, then that's not going to be bundled with the module code, and it's your responsibility to actually make it available on the remote host. Yeah. Then once the dependencies and the module code is identified and it gets zipped, basically it creates a zip package in the memory. Then as you can have like playbook with many, like for example template tasks, so in order not to do the same thing over and over again, so it caches the module code and the dependencies, so it can be reused later on. And then it creates the execution script, which is basically Python script which is generated out dynamically through another Python script. And what's inserted there is the shebang, which is basically the execution of the Python, the path to the Python, which you can specify on the command line, or it's auto-discovered by Ansible. Then also the coding of the script itself, and then the module code with all its dependencies as zipped and base 64 encoded string, and that's actually inserted into the final execution script. And then also the module code and the dependencies, they are like generic. But as you provide some parameters for each of the tasks, which is basically the module, right? So there is also a set of arguments which you need to feed the module to execute what you want to execute on the remote side. So that's another string, which is the module arguments, which is a JSON string, which is then parsed while the module executes on the remote side. And then it basically there is a few more lines of code if the debugging of the remote side is enabled. Otherwise, it's not included to save space and bandwidth on the transfer to the remote side. So, and what you can do on the remote side is you can do the debugging on the remote side. So that's the first command on top. So in order to, so how Ansible works is that if it copies the files over, runs them, then it deletes them and returns you, and you get only the output of the module, right? So no files remain on the remote side. But if you set this environment variable in front of the command, then it keeps the files on the remote side, and you can go and explore them, and you can also rerun the code remotely. So you set this environment variable plus the 3 V's at the end to have real verbose output. And then if you use your playbook or module, then you get very verbose output. It's on these lines, it's like a small snippet. And there you can see a path to the execution script I mentioned before. That's this script. And that's basically the script which is copied from your control host to the remote host, and it's executed through SSH, right? So then if we SSH to the remote host, and we have a look into that directory where that script is, then we can see that there is nothing else than just a single script, right? But the script, as I said, contains a string with zipped data, which is base 64, a string encoded and stuff like that. But you can have a look inside those data if you use, if you run the script with the explode parameter. So that will basically unpack the data for you into the debug directory, in the subdirectory where the script itself resides. And if you have a look, then basically that's the module code. And here are the dependencies in the Ansible namespace. And here are the arguments, which are the parameters of the module, your own parameters, which you pass to the task, right? And then you can go and modify the arguments, modify the dependencies, modify the module itself, the code, yeah. And then if you want to execute the stuff which you just modified, you use this, the script with parameter execute, and it won't execute the original data, but it will execute your modified data. And then you get some response from it in JSON format. Yeah. And that's it. That's simple as that. Any questions?
You said that you don't need any kind of tools on the other side, but you say you said a zipped file over. Do you need zip on the remote?
So the zip is basically a standard library in Python, so you don't need any dependencies. You just need Python on the remote side, and then...
You said that you don't need Python because you can install Python.
Yes, so what you need on the remote side is really only SSH. So you can connect to the remote side and do something there, right? But in order to run Ansible, you need to have Python. Otherwise, Ansible won't run. So you can use a raw module in Ansible, which doesn't use Python, but allows you to execute commands on the remote side through shell only, no Python. But that you can use to install Python. Yeah. So really, the only dependency on the remote side is SSH, and then you can take it from there and install Python, and then you can run fully fledged Ansible on it. Yeah.
I'm assuming this all happens for Linux.
Yeah.
Well, how does it change for Windows?
No idea. I never worked with Windows. What's Windows?
It works the same way.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
It's all PowerShell, so Ansible just uses PowerShell and it communicates over WinRM. Hopefully somebody knows what I've just said, because I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, so you could notice in the code of Ansible there are modules written in Python and in PowerShell. So the PowerShell ones are for Windows. Never really explored that option, but yeah.
I love the way it took Microsoft 30 years to realise the value of the pipe.
Other questions?
There's a question down there, was this one?
Yeah.
Ansible does need sudo access for inside the pipe?
It doesn't need sudo, but for certain operations you need sudo. For example, if you SSHing as an Ansible user, not root, then you need to sudo to be able to modify certain files on the file system.
So how it can be secure?
What do you mean?
If it needs sudo access, so whoever has that.
It doesn't need by default. You can run it under the Ansible user, but if you need access to some file which is owned by root only, and you need to modify that file, then you need sudo to modify that file.
Well, you need to do some form of privilege escalation. It's not necessarily tied to sudo, of course. That's just the obvious one.
And the same applies for connection, because the SSH connection is one of the plugins which Ansible provides to the users. So there's definitely more connection plugins which you can use, not only SSH, and then other methods of copying files over can apply. So I was just describing the SSH path.
one of your slides talking about pipelining. So,
Yeah.
If pipelining is on, then the Ansible Z, all that, did I understand right? It doesn't touch the disk of the remote?
Yes, it goes straight into the Python process through standard input. So basically, it's like pipe through SSH, and then a Python process reads that input of code, and it executes or reads that code and executes it. So it's more secure and faster. So.
Can I? But in this case, is the zipping of the code then really necessary? It just pushes everything?
Yes, because it compresses the code, so it's faster.
Okay.
Or the bandwidth, yeah.
If you're doing the troubleshooting with the remote debug flag, do you actually need to go into Ansible config and disable the pipeline?
Yes. Yes, because then the file is not actually on the disk. Yeah, so the debugging doesn't work if the pipelining is enabled. Correct.
Yeah, so in case of network devices, when you basically generate the config locally, would this remote debugging work locally as well, or what's the process there?
Sorry, can you repeat?
In case of network devices, when you
Network devices, yeah.
on the other side, can you somehow debug these remote files locally?
As I said, the SSH connection is just one of the plugins. There is one more plugin called local, so you can kind of simulate maybe that through the local connection plugin. Yeah, but most of the network devices have SSH connection as well, and this is what's used. This is what the NetApp presentation mentioned earlier, that basically they don't need to install anything on the remote host, but actually they need to have the SSH enabled, right?
Magic. Any more for any more? Jiri, thank you very much.
Okay.